Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending our weekly Enwayaang talk this week. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings.
Thank you, Kat. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Melanie Buttle. I'm the principal of Gzowski College, housed in the Enwayaang building here at Trent University. The Enwayaang building, I was saying before we started recording, the name Enwayaang means the way we speak together, and we created this weekly Enwayaang speaking series so that we had a chance to speak together and have a Q&A and an interesting discussion with different people about their passions and their engaging things that they're doing in the world. So I will introduce our guest today. Originally from the Curve Lake First Nations, just 30 minutes north of Trent University, Drew Hayden Taylor has spent the last couple of decades traveling the world and writing about it from an Aboriginal perspective. He has done a great many things in his career, from performing stand-up comedy at the Kennedy Center in Washington to being artistic director of Canada's premier Native theatre company, Native Earth Performing Arts. Drew is an award-winning playwright, a journalist, a columnist, short story writer, novelist, television scriptwriter, and has worked on numerous documentaries. As a playwright, Drew has been part of what he refers to as the contemporary Native literary renaissance. An author of more than 20 plays, resulting in almost 100 productions, popular plays such as Toronto at Dreamers Rock, Only Drunks and Children Tell the Truth, The Berlin Blues, and Cottagers and Indians have left their mark on the Canadian theatre scene. Some of you may have watched the documentary version of Cottagers and Indians this week at Reframe, or maybe you saw the play in Peterborough. Drew has been the recipient of many awards and honors, including an honorary doctorate of laws from Mount Allison University, a plaque of honor on the Peterborough Walk of Fame. I like that that's right there after the honorary doctorate of laws. That's great. And the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Award, Ontario Premier's Award for Creative Arts and Design, and many, many more. Drew is also a member of the committee that is currently planning the Enwayaang Indigenous Fringe Festival, which is happening this June outdoors on campus. And it is the very first Indigenous Fringe Festival to ever happen that we know of. So we are going to speak together, and after we do that, as Kat said, we'll do a little Q&A. When we get there, there's lots of you here. We may get you to use the little hand icon so we can appropriately get to your questions. And Drew, we're thrilled to have you here to talk about contemporary Indigenous storytelling and your own exploration of storytelling traditions and other passions you have. Chi Miigwech for joining us, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I guess a little bit of more background about me. I'm one of those rare breeds of animals you'll come across occasionally called a professional writer. That is to say, I do not have a day job. I do not spend my afternoons saying, would you like fries with that? But more interestingly, and to me more importantly, I think I'm what you might call a contemporary storyteller. That is to say, this is the 21st century, and there's so many different ways of telling stories. And I am very much interested in exploring all the different avenues of that storytelling. It used to be traditionally, storytelling was done orally. Campfire, kitchen table, whatever you want to remember. But that storytelling tradition expanded to incorporate so many different mediums, right? Then it went into theater, went into print, went into radio, went into television, went into movies. An interesting thing is, like, in the 21st century, there are even video games that are detailed, that contain detailed narratives, that are layered and are very complex in their storytelling tradition. And me, I'm very fascinated with finding as many, or exploring and celebrating as many ways to tell stories as I can. You heard that I have 33 published books, and some of them are plays, some of them are prose, some of them are short stories. One is a graphic novel, some of them are nonfiction. I've written plays, I've written television shows, documentaries. All of them are just so much fun and so interesting to use to tell that story. For me, it all comes down to the story and what's the best way to tell it. You heard I'm from Curve Lake. I was born and raised there. And the thing about growing up there in Curve Lake, as you may know or not know, I'm about 1,000 years old. And when I was growing up there, we had 3 television stations. And for the young people who don't understand this term, those 3 television stations were very snowy. And if you don't know what that term means, ask one of your elders or your parents. So I watched television when I could, but most of the time, because there's only so many times you go swimming, only so many times you can climb a tree or whatever, I read. I read and I read and I read, and I loved reading. It took me to faraway places that I thought this little res boy would never go. So I would take all these books that came from spots all over the world that somehow landed in the lap of this little boy in Curve Lake. And as I read them, I would think, wow, wouldn't it be cool? Wouldn't it be interesting if someday I could tell stories about my community and send them around the world? Who knew if that would happen? So I started to think more and more about writing, because I discovered at an early age, when you want to write something, when you want to create something, that world has to be as real as the world you live in. It has to be as 3-dimensional. It has to have as many details. The characters in that story have to have the same amount of personality and reality as your best friend. And I discovered at an early age that I had more control over the universe I created than the universe I lived in. And I liked that. So I decided I wanted to be a writer. Unfortunately, things were not a smooth ride when it came to that, because as I said, when I was growing up, there were very few other Native writers. So before the internet, before all of that, and my library, my school library, and we didn't have one on the reserve, didn't have any books by Native people. There was the occasional book about Native people by white writers, but none really by Native writers. And I wasn't sure if Native people could write stories, if we were allowed to, or any of that. And I decided to do some research. So I went out, I asked 2 very important people to me who I thought might be able to provide guidance. The first person I asked was my grade 11 English teacher in Lakefield District Secondary School, which I believe now doesn't exist. And I went to him, and I remember walking in the door of homeroom. He was sitting at the desk, and he was looking for something in the bottom left-hand drawer of his desk. That's how much I remember the story. And I went up to him and I said, "Sir, is it possible to make a living from creative writing?" And without looking up, he said, "No, not really." And that stayed with me. My grade 11 English teacher telling me there's not much point in being a writer. And I mean, the decades passed, and I did reach a certain amount of success in the publishing world. And I find myself, one of the things I do now as a writer is I frequently lecture at high schools across Canada. And when I go in and I talk to young people today, I'm sitting there, I'm talking with them, and I always tell them, the one thing I can teach you, the only thing you need to know, when you walk out of the store, walk out of this room, the only piece of information or word of advice I can give you is never trust your grade 11 English teacher. And here's the irony, right? A couple of years later, when I did become a writer, and one of my plays, Toronto Dreamers Rock, became very, very successful, the teacher went on to become a principal, and I made very sure my play toured to his school. And I hear now that he used to hear that he used to actually proudly tell people he told me not to be a writer. For some reason, he's very proud of that fact. Everybody's a critic. The second person I told was my mother. I told my mother I wanted to be a writer, and my mother looked at me with a very perplexed look and said, "Why do you want to be a writer? It's not going to get you anywhere." That was my mother, and I understand perfectly where my mother was coming from. My mother's first language was Anishinaabe. She had a grade 6 education. She'd spent most of her life cooking and cleaning for white people. So the idea of being a writer was just literally not on her radar. And And so I understood where she was coming from. And then with all this, I decided to give up wanting to be a writer. But I didn't know what else to do. As I said, this was around grade 11 or whatever. And around this time, as I'm sure everybody there knows, I assume they still do this. We were given a book of universities and colleges to look at, because I was getting ready to graduate and grade 12, go off and seek my fortune. And it became very apparent to me. I noticed two very important things at this particular stage in my life. One, that I was related to practically all the girls in my reserve. Because you have to keep in mind, I come from a very big family. My mother was the oldest of 14. And I come from a very small reserve, so I was related to everybody. So the best cure for that was to go to college. So I decided to go to college, go to the big city of Toronto, and I took radio and television broadcasting, which was like the worst thing I could take because I was a very shy young kid. And basically, I took a journalism course, and the idea of phoning people up and asking them questions that were frankly none of my business was like the worst job I could take, but whatever. Anyways, I went to college, and I'm in a unique situation where a lot of people spend their lives going out and looking for their art, trying to grab their art, trying to embrace it and make it theirs. I'm the flip side. I had found my art in my teen years, but I had rejected it. And it wasn't until my mid-20s when my art tracked me down, kicked me in the ass, and told me I was a writer. So basically, it wasn't until my mid-20s that I started writing seriously. And at the age of 25, again, this is for all the oldies in the audience there. At the age of 25, I my first real serious writing credit through a bizarre series of coincidences. I ended up writing an episode of a television show called The Beachcombers. And then I started writing more television. I wrote Street Legal, I wrote North of 60, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I got working in theater because at this time, as you heard, was the contemporary native literary renaissance, a term I created. Because before then, as I said, there wasn't a lot of Indigenous publishing, theater, or anything happening. But in 1986, Thompson Highway wrote and had a play produced called The Res Sisters, which in my opinion sort of revolutionized things. And all of a sudden there was this explosion of Indigenous literature. And Thompson was the artistic director of Canada's premier Native theatre company, Native Earth Performing Arts. And he had a grant for what was called the Writer in Residency program at Native Earth. But there were only two working Native playwrights in Ontario at that time. There was himself and Daniel David Moses, who was the outgoing playwright in residence. So he was desperate. He had this money to spend, but no one to spend it on. So he did what a lot of desperate people do. He went to the bottom of the barrel, and there I was, passed out. And he asked me if I wanted to be the writer in residence for Native Earth, and I said no. I knew nothing of theater. I hadn't seen any theater. To me, theater was pretentious, and I didn't really understand it. Television paid better, and they fed you. But at this time, I was between contracts, and I had a very hungry landlord that liked to be fed on a regular basis. So he cheated. Thompson cheated and said, "Look at it this way, Drew. It's through the rehearsal of two plays. Maybe you write a play at the end of it. It's 2 weeks, and you get a big check every week." And I said, "When do I start?" So I'm one of the few people you'll meet that got into theater for the money. And that's my glory. Seriously, I'm not joking. That's my glorious introduction to the world of theater. And so I started working in theater, and it was a major revelation to me. I mean, for a number of reasons, but that would take too long to get into. But what I sort of discovered was I was there during this explosion, and I noticed something really very interesting. The vast majority of plays, novels, poetry, etc., coming out of the First Nations community, the stories were dark, depressing, bleak, sad, and angry. All the characters were either oppressed, depressed, or suppressed. And I had trouble understanding this because I've been very fortunate. I've traveled to over 140, 150 First Nation communities across Canada and United States. And everywhere I went, I was greeted with a laugh, a smile, and a joke. And I wasn't seeing this in our literature. But I understood where it was coming from, because essentially, when an oppressed people get their voice back, they're going to write about being oppressed. So after hundreds of years of colonization, of oppression, racism, the residential school system, reserves, etc., these Native people are getting their voice back, and they were writing about that. And all the stories that were pouring out from these authors basically had three narratives. They were either victim narratives, historical narratives, or stories about the byproduct of what I call post-contact stress disorder. And this was all fine, but I was uncomfortable. I didn't want to write stories about death, about racism, about rape, about all these different things. And I was wondering where other people were doing that much better than me. And I was wondering, what was my place in this world as a First Nations author? And I was in the wonderful situation of meeting an elder from the Blood Reserve in Alberta, who told me that in his opinion, for Native people, humor is the WD-40 of healing. And that stayed with me. I really, really liked that. Thompson Highway has a saying, I think it's in an essay in that is in Dried Up Side of Move to Kappas Casing, where he says, before the healing can take place, the poison must be exposed. And that was that whole thing of all the stuff that was coming out. It was a cathartic thing. It was a healing thing. But I was thinking more and more about what this elder told me. Humor is the WD-40 of healing, and I wanted to participate. I wanted to help with the healing. So I began to embrace the world of humor. So I started to write humorous plays. I started to write humorous articles and essays for the Globe and Mail, for CBC, for Now Magazine, etc. And they seemed to be quite popular. And then from there, I just my life progressed. I kept getting asked to do all these different things. So I was asked to write a novel. I was asked to write a book of nonfiction about different aspects. So I began to expand, and these stories presented themselves to me, and I would sit down and I would think, what is the best way to tell the story? What's the best form? Is this a nonfiction essay? Is this a play? Is this a short story? Is this a novel? Is this a television show? So that's part of the fun, part of the battle of what I do. And so in today's world, as a contemporary writer, contemporary storyteller, I'm still juggling all those different things today. In the last 10 months of the COVID lockdown, I've been keeping very, very busy, embracing all of these things. So in the last 10 months, I've written a novel, which is sort of a native horror novel. I have finished a book, a collection, a series of essays on Indigenous futurisms, where Indigenous people will be in the next 10, 20, 50, 60 years, or where they should be. I have written 2 plays, and I have done the post-production on a 13-part television series I'm doing for APTN, a documentary series called Going Native, and it explores basically interesting people, places, and things in the First Nations community in Canada and the States that me and my fellow producers think should be highlighted and people should know about. And it airs, I think, in March or April. And it's internally, when they watched it at APTN, they liked it so much, even without it airing, they've given us a second season. So we're waiting for all the dust to settle from this whole COVID stuff before we can go out and start doing season 2. So I've kept myself pretty busy, so still telling my stories, if somewhat isolated, and looking forward to going back out into the world to either experience or find new stories. So I think I'll leave it off there.
Great, thank you so much. You have been busy.
Yeah, it's a living.
Some people just sort of shut down in pandemic. I guess you really went for it.
I've got laundry to do.
I want to ask you who your high school English teacher was, because I probably had that teacher too, but I think my dad taught you biology, so my dad's off the hook on
Actually,
that.
no, I never had him. I don't think. My high school teacher was a Mr. Wilfred Hughes.
Yeah. Yep, I know who that is. Okay, enough about high school. Thank you so much. That was quite inspiring. I'm going to turn to our audience to ask some questions. So as Kat said at the beginning, I think what we'll do, because there's a lot of you here, put your little hand up on the screen and I'll try to get to you in some semblance of order, or you can type something in the chat. Maybe Kat, I'll sort of look for hands, and Kat, you can look in the little chat box, and we'll see how that goes. Awesome.
Two
Okay.
thumbs up from Kat.
Great. All right. I'm scanning now.
I just want to mention that maybe if you're not sure where to find the hand, it's at the bottom of your screen in the reactions. If you click the little reactions face, you'll get a hand so that you can put a hand up.
All right. I can't tell if Robbie's just clapping or actually has a question, so I'm just going to ask Robbie first.
Okay, yes, I do have a question. Thank you very much for the talk, Mr. Hayden Taylor. Yes, it's very inspiring, I hope, especially for some of the younger writers. I just wonder what your thoughts are about, you're a storyteller, you're telling stories, but of course you have to tell those stories to the larger community in ways that not only do they understand, but they appreciate. And as you say, they want to hear more. They want to buy more seasons of it. So how do you walk that line between sort of staying rooted in traditional culture and not being interpolated by the values of the larger culture, if that's a good question?
Yeah, I often get asked similar questions to that, and for me, it's not difficult because I grew up in Curve Lake, but I'm also a creature of the 20th and 21st century. I don't really have that problem. The short story, the novel I just finished is a contemporary Native horror story about the Wendigo prowling around a university in Toronto, and the hero that goes up to battle him is an over-the-hill Indigenous hockey player. So these things are very easy because these are my everyday life. I was raised with traditional stories and contemporary stories. In fact, I remember talking with a traditional storyteller from Birch Island up near Manitoulin Island, who told me that we need new stories as much as we need the old stories. And that stayed with me. So I consider myself, as I said, a contemporary storyteller. And for me, it's not a problem to mix all those things together and come out with stories that are infused with both elements, because I am infused with both elements.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to give you the order really quick. So Marin, and then Emily, Alex, and I think Sean, and then we'll go to Armand has one in the chat. So Marin, nice to see you again. It's been a while. You're up.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Yes, it's great to see you. And Aneen, greetings of peace. Salam alaikum, Drew Hayden Taylor. It's good to see you and hear you. Again, I was a student at Trent. I'm really grateful to you for your work, for your commitment to telling stories of truth and giving us a more in-depth understanding from an Anishinaabe perspective. I come from Afghanistan and Iran, and something that I often think about as well is our stories. Like, where are our people's stories told by our own people? So I have two questions for you. One of them is, how would you, I guess, what words of wisdom do you have for folks that want to turn to their stories and to tell their own stories, even though we may not have access to our ancestors and our original teachings? And then my second question to you is about kind of your journey in deciding when a piece is appropriate for a play versus a novel versus a short story. Tashakkur miigwech in advance.
Oi, gavolt. I guess the first one is I'm trying to wrap my mind around this. The thing about stories is stories are the DNA of a culture. The stories that are told by a people spring from their environment, from their language, from their priorities in life. Stories reflect the philosophy of the culture. They reflect the humor of the culture. They reflect the history of the culture, all these different things. So when you sit down to write a story based on a story or incorporate all of that, I don't like sit there and deconstruct anything I'm doing. What I do is I try and, to me, the spirit of the story is what is important, where I'm sitting down thinking that those stories told by our elders were told for a specific reason. They were there to illustrate a foible of humanity. They were there to tell us something about the natural world. They're there to tell us how and why people are the way they are. So I keep that in mind when I'm sitting down and writing. One of my novels, Motorcycles and Sweetgrass, was basically a contemporized Indigenous legend where I took the trickster, a character from our cosmology, our mythology, and put him in a contemporary environment on a 1953 Indian chief motorcycle. And I think in a bizarre sort of way, he's in, like, as I said, a reserve at the time in 2010. It's one of the most, I'd have to say, straightforward, honest stories a la storytelling that I could do, because much like the stories I grew up with of the trickster coming in and doing strange things, that's what happened in this story. He came and he did strange things in a contemporary environment. So it was a very familiar story, but it was a very new story. So I just look at the story, I just try and find the spirit of what is trying to be said in any individual story or series of stories, because frequently in many cultures, one story leads to another, leads to another, and leads to another, and you can be there for days following the progression of all these stories going through. So it's just, what do you want to say, how do you want to say it, and what makes, take out of it. I almost said what makes it important today, which is the wrong way of looking at it. All stories are important because all stories reflect humanity. They reflect who we are and who our people were and still are. So I would just say, what is it you're trying to say, and what does your story say that you just need to, I don't know, put a pair of glasses on it, some sneakers, and a motorcycle. I don't think that's that. I don't think the stories don't change. There are more similarities in these stories than are differences, and it's not converting them, it's just sort of reinterpreting them. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I will take that. And what was the second question?
Yeah, it does answer my question. Thank you. The second question was when you're writing, because you said for you, it starts with the story and you go through that process before you look at how to tell the story, whether it's in the form of a play or a short story or novel.
Well, that doesn't mean that they can't wander across each other. Usually if it's a smaller story, it's a short story or a one-act play or whatever. And if it's a bigger story, it's a two-act play or a novel or whatever. But if there's any up-and-coming writers out there who are working on projects that they're worried about, let me put it this way. My first novel, the Night Wanderer, about an Ojibwe vampire, was a play I originally wrote about 10 years before, and it didn't work as a play. I wasn't happy with it. It didn't gel together. I actually saw it produced and I didn't like it, so I never had it published or had it produced together. And then I was put in a position of, I was asked to write a novel, and I was trying to think, oh God, I got to write a novel now. How do I put together this big universe of a novel? Then I remembered this play I wrote that didn't work, and I thought maybe it didn't work because it wasn't supposed to work. Maybe it was supposed to be a novel that I wasn't ready to write yet. So I dug that play out, and I thought, and it became my novel. And I thought, that is so cool. My next novel, Motorcycle and Sweetgrass, was a movie I had written about 10 years earlier that I couldn't get sold to make into a movie, and so I just put it on a shelf. And then when I had to do another novel, as I pulled it off, blew the dust off, and everything I needed to write a novel was in there. And so I took it and I wrote it, and it became Motorcycles and Sweetgrass. My last book, Chasing Painted Horses, started off as a short story in my collection of short stories, Fearless Warriors, and I really liked it. There was something about it that haunted me. I took it, I turned it into a one-act play for kids called Girl Who Loved Her Horses, and I wasn't finished with it. There was more there that needed to be told, and it kept bothering me until about a couple of years ago. I sat down and I wrote it as a novel, and it became a novel, Chasing Painted Horses. So you may take a story, and if it doesn't work, don't throw it out. Whatever you do, don't throw it out. My next novel is going to be another play I did that was produced once that I think will make a great novel. So keep everything you have that you don't think work or you can't sell. Maybe the reason it's not working is you're not ready to write it, or two, it's not in the medium it's supposed to be in. Stories frequently will tell you and how they want to be written and when they want to be written. Other than that, you just have to sit there and understand the story you're telling. Is it as detailed as a novel? A novel, you're doing interior monologue, you're creating everything. In a play, you're writing the dialogue, and it's about an hour and 45 minutes long. Documentary is a different kettle of fish. You just basically have to know what your options are and which will best suit the story you want to tell.
Amazing. Gichimi-gwet.
Thanks for that, and thanks, Maren. I'm going to turn to Emily, who I think is the instructor that we were talking about a few minutes ago. So Emily, you're next.
Yeah, the irony, I'm a settler teaching Indigenous fictions, but
you have my permission.
Thank you. And I teach a class called Contagion, which looks at contagions in metaphor form, illnesses, and we did the Night Wanderer. So you actually answered my question about I was going to ask you about the evolution of that book. So you answered that question. So now I'm thinking about Take Me to Your Chief, which we all love. That those stories are fantastic, and I was wondering where the inspiration for those stories came from.
Well, I'm just a diehard science fiction fan. I've always loved science fiction from the point of like when I would catch again Star Trek on my television through the haze of snow from bad broadcasting. I just would read and read and read, and I just fell in love with it. And again, we weren't embracing science fiction. We were sort of, again, stuck in the negativity of colonization. But the great thing about science fiction is, science fiction is often referred to as the bastard cousin, or the unwanted child of literature. But the great thing about science fiction is it does exactly what other mainstream literature does. It explores the human condition. It just uses different tools. If you've ever heard Robert Sawyer lecture about science fiction as a metaphor, it's brilliant, because you look at the Time Machine is an exploration of class system in England. War of the Worlds is an exploration of colonization from Mars to Earth, and the added irony is they're colonizing England, which is the great colonizer. And he tells this story of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley's mother was the famous Mary if I'm pronouncing this right, Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft, who, and according to what Robert Sawyer says, Frankenstein novel about what would happen if men took the ability to create life away from women. And it doesn't turn out well, shall we say. So the great thing about science fiction is you can explore all the same social elements that regular literature does, just using different tools. And that was so the fun of it. I explored colonization. I explored superheroes, Native people in space, government cover-ups, all these different things. And they were just stories that were backing up in my head that I was just looking for an excuse, a way, and a need to write. And I have to say, Take Us to Your Chief was one of the most enjoyable projects I have ever worked on in my life. And, it's actually a thin book. I was so in such a hurry to get it out because it was just bursting out of me. I probably could have put another 2 or 3 stories in it.
It was great. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I really love the stories in it, and I use them all the time.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. That's great. So before I go to Alex, I just wanted to read, we had a little message in the chat from Erica saying, thanks for everything you've shared. There's 2 of them on screen. We are both in our 4th year at Trent in the teacher education stream. Wanted to share that your book, Motorcycles and Sweetgrass, was the first Indigenous novel we read in our 1st year education course, and it has shaped the way we think, and we hope to include this type of material in our own classrooms one day. Woohoo! That is such great news.
I'm curious why. Why does it shape the way you think?
Hello, can you guys hear us?
I can hear you.
I guess just because there's so much like intertextuality and so much going on in that book that kind of joins like nature and your life and spirituality and everything kind of together in one like coherent story. And I had never read anything like that before. And it was just really beautiful and really moving. And I was like, when I'm a teacher one day, I need to have things like this in my classroom just to continue the conversation. And you're good.
No, you covered it.
Yeah.
Even the anthropomorphic raccoons?
Oh yeah, especially.
My agent, when she read it, she suggested strongly that I eliminate all the raccoons from the first draft, saying specifically, you realize a good chunk of your audience will be urban people, and urban people do not like raccoons, so you're automatically going to alienate a good chunk of your potential audience. So I almost cut out the raccoons.
Well, thank goodness you didn't, clearly. I'm going to turn to, thanks for that, Erica. I'm going to turn to Alex.
Hello. It's kind of funny, actually, because I was also going to talk about the education program and Motorcycles and Sweetgrass, funnily enough. So really great timing. Because in our first year in the education stream, we used it as sort of a focal point and a lens to talk about intergenerational trauma and the effect of residential schools. And given what you said, like within this talk about how you were resisting previous trends by trying to write funnier and more endearing works of Indigenous fiction, how do you feel about works like Motorcycles and Sweetgrass being used to understand the past like that?
I find it very, very interesting because there have been times for instance, I was going to be the writer in residence again at Native Earth like 25 years later. And the artistic director at that time told me, Drew, I know you can be funny, but I want you to be serious. And another very well-known playwright who again was an artistic director told me that she despised, that was her word, my comedy, The Berlin Blues. So frequently a lot of people who are more educated and better off than me don't really like my Indigenous humor from within the Indigenous community. So I always find I'm always a little gun shy when people are want to talk about my humorous work. I was sort of thinking about Motorcycles and Sweetgrass, and frequently I've read reviews and comments where it touches on residential schools, but then I think of Sammy. Sammy's such a small, minor character in it that I really don't know that qualifies as an exploration of the residential school system or whatever. But you heard me talk earlier about the important that stories in whatever form are a reflection, are a fingerprint, are a DNA of what is happening in our culture today. And at one time, we were focused and obsessed with the trials and tribulations of coming out of colonialism. Now I think we're more geared towards really more interesting ways of exploring the Indigenous experience. Look at, somebody, you mentioned, Take Us to Your Chief. Well, there's been this absolutely phenomenal explosion of science fiction in the First Nations community. You have Wabagisha Bryce's The Moon of the Crusted Snow. You have Sherry Demeline's The Marrow Thieves. And down in the States, you have this Pueblo woman, Rebecca Roanhorse, who wrote this book called Reign of Lightning, I think it's called, that was exceedingly popular and was so successful that this Pueblo writer was hired by Star Wars, the Star Wars Corporation, to write one of their novels. So I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but I just think the fact that people are finding a huge universe within Motorcycles and Sweetgrass, when I was sitting there writing it on the reserve in my office thinking, who is going to care about some weird guy on an island creating an Indigenous martial art? Who's going to care about anthropomorphic raccoons? And I actually had somebody sort of raise an eyebrow that I made Nanabush come back looking like a white guy, wondering, what am I trying to say with that, Drew? So I find it just absolutely fabulous that people find it a usable vehicle for teaching. I'm honored and I'm thrilled.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks for that, Alex. I'm going to read Armand's question from the chat and then turn to Sean. So Armand asked, curious how your stories and experiences resonate with Indigenous peoples in other countries, such as the US, Australia, New Zealand, etc.
I have no idea. There's not really a lot of literature shared. I mean, you really have to go out of your way in Canada to find literature by Maori or Aborigine writers. I was in, actually almost 1 year ago, about 13, 14 months ago, I was in Australia for the Melbourne Book Festival. And I was there and I did 3 or 4 sessions and went to sign books, and not one single person bought a book. I spent a week in Melbourne, a lot of money to bring me over, and nobody bought a single book. So there's not really that much interaction between writers here and writers over there yet. But I, got my fingers and toes crossed that dialogue will increase and hopefully generate more sharing of stories.
At least you got a trip. That's nice.
Yeah. Yes.
Thanks. Sean.
Hello. So I'm an international student from Malaysia, and I also love writing. And I guess I was just curious. Well, one of the biggest issues for me is I find myself stuck trying to, or I feel as though I don't have the experience trying to write something that a lot of other people have experienced. As an example, like I feel like I don't have authority over the Malaysian story, as an example, or let's say I'm really interested in stories of addiction, and I feel like I don't want to speak for everybody who deals with addiction, as an example, and I feel like I don't have that authority, and I feel like you must have to deal with that in a lot of ways as an Indigenous writer. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, I mean, when I wrote a book about being a vampire, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not a vampire, and I did not hear any uproar of anger from the vampire community over appropriation. So basically, I would just tell you, as long as you're respectful of your source material and who you're aiming it at. I've never been to residential school, but it pops up in a lot of my writing, and I don't do a detailed exploration. I did in one play, God and the Indian, even though I've never been to residential school. I find if you just approach it with a certain amount of respect and understanding, and do your research, make sure you know what you're writing about. It shouldn't be a problem. I mean, you tell one joke to 100 people, 97 people will find it funny, 3 people will find it objectionable. That is the natural state of humanity. So I get flack occasionally from some of my stuff, but overall the pluses outweigh the minuses exponentially. And I would just tell you, go and run with that. I don't know specifically what you're going to write about, what you want to write about, as you said, addiction or whatever. But I think I don't think you need to be an addict to write about addiction any more than you need to have committed suicide to write about suicide.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was a great question, Sean. I'm going to read Colton's from the chat here. It's kind of a nice one to think about in contemporary world. Colton asked, what were some stories by others that provided the quote WD-40 of healing with humor template for you in your early career and of any medium, he said. And then, and if possible, what are some stories that have provided that for you recently, which is a really nice way to bring us to what we're, what you're reading now. So what provided that WD-40 humor in your early career, and what are you reading right now?
Well, as I said, there wasn't a lot of fun Indigenous stuff early in my career. I had to go carve out my little niche of humor in a lot of the darker stuff. But I'm a huge fan of Tom King. Many of you can't remember his radio series, Dead Dog Cafe, but a lot of his writing deals with humor. It celebrates the Indigenous funny bone, and I really like that, and I consider him a friend, and I am by all understanding of the word a fan of his. So at one point we were the only ones out there doing stuff. There were no native comedians at the time, but now humor has gotten a little more broad-based and more popular. So we're not alone in the woods telling jokes anymore. Sorry, what was the second question?
What you're reading now.
Oh, God. Okay.
Some humor in what you're reading now, hopefully.
Well, not all humor. You have to understand, I also write a lot for the Globe and Mail. I'm a regular contributor for the Globe and Mail, and I write on a whole bunch of different topics. So my reading list is absolutely humongous in terms of I have to read world literature, I have to read Canadian literature, I have to read Indigenous literature. I get asked to comment on science fiction, so I have to read a lot of science fiction. I like to read quirky stuff that makes no sense, that I'd almost be embarrassed to share with you. So I have literally, I'm not joking, a laundry bin full of books at home that I get books, I throw them in, and then as I get low, I pick up a book there and I start reading it. So I read just about everything. There's no coherent rhyme or reason to what I'm reading. Right now, I'm reading a book about taking place in, it's a nonfiction book about when, it is going to sound really weird and you're going to look at me going, what the hell, about when a Japanese company, Sony, bought a major Hollywood studio and how that turned everything up and down. Because I'm interested in filmmaking. And again, the transferring of stories from one medium to the other. So I wanted to know how the movie making business works. So I read that. I read Why Indigenous Literature Matters by Daniel Heath Justice. I'm trying to remember all the stuff I've read. I read Tom King's new book, Indians on Vacation. And I am just about to read Stephen King's new collection of short stories. So again, I read anything and everything. I just hoover it up.
Nice, thank you. I was thinking, I mean, I'm going to go to one last question, but I was actually thinking about Thompson Highway and reading his plays in university and how funny he is when he's interviewed, like how funny he is as a person, but how much deep, hard content he sometimes writes. I just was thinking about that as you were talking.
Yep, that is Thompson.
Yep. Okay. Mitchell asked, I'm just going to read this out. I was recently sent an Archive Association of Ontario draft publication, a reconciliation framework for Canadian archives, July 2020. Drew, do you believe that access to Indigenous sources is improving?
I'm not exactly if I'm sure I understand what that is. Indigenous source access, reconciliation framework, Canadian archives. I don't know what any of that means.
Well, I'll maybe Mitchell will come on and or speak it to us, but I think he's talking about the fact that archive, like the Ontario archives or Canadian archives, are trying to look at reconciliation, or at least work on bringing the Truth and Reconciliation Committee into their own practice. And I think he's asking if access to materials is improving. Mitchell, are you there?
Yes, Melanie, thanks for the help. Yeah,
I don't know if access is improving. I that's not my area of expertise. I don't know.
I know you have a wonderful gallery there at Curve Lake.
Oh yes, that's yeah, the Wheatongues Gallery. Yes.
Yes. But yeah, just to access for your research, you know, you have your stories and they're wonderful stories, but for somebody like myself who isn't as familiar with that process, how do you do your research otherwise?
It depends on what I am working on at the time. When I did my thing on residential schools, God in the Indian, I just talked to residential school survivors and just sat down, talked to them. Other times, like when I was doing motorcycles on Sweetgrass, I actually found an expert in the 1953 Indian Chief motorcycle somewhere in Oshawa and spent an hour on the phone quizzing, getting details for my book. You know, and you do a science fiction thing, even though most of it is made up, there still has to be a fair amount of accurate scientific bedrock from which to build on when you're going. And because I do read a lot of science, I have a lot of that, but I do remember phoning around trying to get information on this, that, or the other thing. So, I mean, it's just good old fashioned research that I'm sure your students know a little about too.
Yeah, that's the best way. Thanks, Drew.
No problem.
Okay, I think I have one last one that's kind of a big one, so it may be hard to do. And we are we're going to release a poll and we're wrapping up here, and I hope that you can answer our quick poll about how you heard about our event. But the last one's big, Drew, but it's sort of how I don't know how really. I'm going to reread that. Hang on. How do we address Indigenous identity claims by non-Indigenous writers? So I mean, there's been a couple of notable cases of identity questions around fiction writers, and I guess a couple thoughts on that, if you are willing.
Well, it is a topic of contemporary consideration. I mean, the whole Michelle Latimer, Joseph Boyden issue. My last 2 or 3 articles for the Globe and Mail have dealt with that, and I think Tamara Bell wants to institute a Indigenous Authenticity Act, like an actual government act that would basically be responsible for, if you said you were Native, you had to prove you were Native. And I don't know how successful that's going to be, because we have a similar act already in place called the Indian Act. You know, I have a status card saying I'm Indian, but it's been very controversial and very limited. So I don't know what kind of other act Tamara's looking for. She said, you know, maybe a letter from an elder on a reserve or from the band office, but it's pretty much, you know, there are ways around it. There are ways to circumvent it. So I don't know how successful it is. What the answer is, I don't know. It's a complex issue. I personally don't know why. Well, actually I do why. You know, for several hundred years, Native people were oppressed, but now that we're climbing out of that we're successful, we're telling our stories, and we're finally having a chance to be successful. Now people want to be us.
Yeah, okay. Actually, that was a pretty succinct answer, all things considered, and I think great to go back and read those Globe articles, I think, to hear a bit more about that. You've been a fantastic audience and a fantastic speaker for us, Drew. I really appreciate your time this evening. It was nice to see so many people on screen too. I know it's very tempting to turn your screen off, but for me, watching all of your pictures and seeing nods and smiles, it really helps run a Zoom event. So thank you everyone for coming. Drew, thanks so much for joining us. That was a great experience, and we had lots of thanks in the comments. So thanks everyone for sending the love our way. We really appreciate it. Drew, anything you want to say as we hit stop here?
No, just keep reading what you can. That makes life so much interesting. Movies and television are great, but there's just something about a book.
Agreed, totally. Thank you for that. We do post the edited recording on our Gzowski College website. You can always email gzowski@trentu.ca. That's GZOWSKI@trentu.ca if you want to send you links to everything. So thanks everyone for coming. Miigwech, Drew, thanks for all of your insight, and we'll see you all again. We're here every Thursday at 4 o'clock. Bye, all.
Woohoo!